Cromwell said, trust in God and keep your powder dry. And I'm afraid that you only are aware of the first part. Trust in God. Your powder, that's you who keep it dry. And that is why I would like. I think nothing is there are also good tests. I have quite a few A's, and I have a sizable number of B pluses, which are excellent, I would say, introductions for getting A's in the final. And even those who have not had their good day, let's put it neutrally, even if you have a D in the midterm, it depends on you whether you can get a final, even a final A with a D midterm, on the condition that you draw the right lessons and that you work harder for the final test. Because as I also told the dean, I do consider the midterm test as a test of adjustment. If it works fine, so better then you know right away how to handle the problem for at the moment of the final test. And if you missed the midterm, then I invite you very strongly to be here next time. I will give the test certainly back on Tuesday, and I will take a full hour to go over each question and to let you know what I expected as an answer. But in general terms, I want you to be a little bit more serious in the preparation of the personality chapters out of FEST. Because I have sometimes the impression that some of you, even though you answer the question, but I'm desperately looking for elements which I can trace back to FEST. So please do that a little bit more seriously next time. This being said, there is no reason for despair, but there is nonetheless every reason, at least for some of you, to wake up and draw the right kind of conclusions. This being said, we return now to where we left last time. We were talking about the last part of Hitler's efforts to establish his personal dictatorial totalitarian control over Germany. And remember, we are talking about the time period from August 1933 till August 1934. And what was at stake was Hitler wanted to also get full control over three institutions which escaped him so far. One was the presidency. The president could still dismiss him. The other one was the army, and the third one was the SA. Now, even though theoretically he was the supreme commander of the SA, in reality, the man who was the real boss of the SA until June the 30th, 1934, was Ernst Röhm as chief of staff. And we had seen last time that it was this SA problem which was practically at the basis of all the other problems, at the basis of who would become president and also who would control the army. Now, we had seen last time that Röhm had overlooked and overplayed his game, and so Hitler decided to get rid of him. And the two lieutenants who helped him in this business, one was Göring, who still was in his best days, and the other one was Himmler, as head of the SS. We had seen that from June the 30th and even the next 2 days continuing, the SS and the Gestapo together shot, or we should say in normal civilian terms, assassinated something like 400 to 500 people. And amongst those was the SA leadership. That is all those who formed Röhm's team. They were all done away with, but not only were they done away with, but also others were added to the list. Some were added to the list on Hitler's request, particularly those who had let down Hitler in the famous Munich putsch of November 9th to the 10th, 1923, or those who had intrigued against him, like Schleicher in 1933, 1932, early 1933, and ultimately also others who had, for reasons of personal, I would say, vengeance or resentments, who had irritated one or the other higher up. So that this settling of accounts was called later on the Night of the Long Knives. Now Hitler viewed this was of course, this was an it was settling of accounts, like a situation as it happened also in Chicago in the early 30s in this gang warfare. This was really like a gang warfare inside the Nazi regime. Hitler, nonetheless, Hitler went to parliament, he went public, and in a speech he justified this action, because after all, the president, he was not yet there. Hindenburg, the least one could say, was probably surprised, at least, to over this wave of assassinations. And so Hitler pretended that he was acting in a situation of emergency, that he had discovered a conspiracy in which Röhm and the SA leadership was involved, and also a foreign power in order to overthrow the Nazi regime and Hitler in particular. Now, he did not name the foreign power, but it was evident that he meant France. And so it was just to prevent such a coup from happening, did Hitler order this kind of, I would say, fast justice, if you can call this justice, this execution outside of the normal forms of a civilized country. That was his explanation. And most people had, let's say, double thoughts about it, but he got away with it. At least he got away with those who were important for his future. Hindenburg did not protest, he was already anyway in an advanced stage of passing away. The army considered that Hitler had fulfilled their request to solve the problem Röhm, so the generals did not have to be afraid any longer about Röhm's plans of merging the army with the SA. But besides the, I would say, the immediate reason, the personal reason Hitler might have followed, that Röhm represented a threat, a danger of a potential political military coup in the future. Hitler, nonetheless, in his complex way of thinking, made a reflection which was the following. Röhm and the SA had played an important role in his rise to power. Despite the fact that he had come to power legally, that is, that he had been appointed by the president, chancellor, and that he had won a majority, and that he had even won a two-thirds majority to change the constitution, Röhm's SA, as a background, as an intimidation force, and also a force spreading violence, had nonetheless intimidated really all Hitler's opponents. So in other words, Röhm's activity and that the SAs had been instrumental in his rise to power, beyond all other considerations. But now he was in power. So in other words, he did not need Rome any longer. But he needed the generals, he needed the army. You could of course say, why did he not settle accounts with Rome earlier? Why did he not do it differently? This had to do with Hitler's, I would say, basic attitude to playing one against the other. He had, of course, played the essay against the army. He did not want to depend on the army unilaterally. And that is why he had let Rome, have his time and develop. It was only at the end that he felt Rome was going too far and that he did not need Rome anymore. But when Rome was assassinated with the Azay leadership, and when the Azay danger was removed, the generals could, of course, breath. They felt that they were now rid of a real threat. The real winner, nonetheless, in this instance, was not only Hitler, but was Himmler and the SS. Because contrary to what Hitler had promised the army, that they would remain the only arms and weapons bearers inside the regime, Hitler broke this word right away, because he allowed, first of all, Himmler was given full independence. Until Röhm's assassination, the SS had been integrated in this Azay group. It was a sub-agency of the Azay. Now the SS were given full independence. They stood on their own. And Himmler was allowed to create an armed SS. Well, the SS had anyway pistols and machine guns or what have you. But now they were allowed to set up practically the equivalent of a regular army unit, except that it was an SS army unit. Now, the purpose of this was, Hitler wanted to have, besides the official army, also a kind of party or private army. Now, this was originally a very small group. They were the so-called Verfügungstruppen, which would mean, in translation, emergency or troops, forces which could be used in an emergency situation. They were at his disposition in need. The second thought was, if ever a military coup would be planned against Hitler, he could then use this small group, this small army unit. Now, what is interesting, and you do not have to write this down, but there was a kind of parallel evolution taking place in the Soviet Union a little bit later, 1 or 2 years later. Stalin, in his internal empire and in his internal personal totalitarian regime, allowed his own secret police, the NKVD, to set up also regular armed forces with tank divisions, air force divisions, and so on. And so Hitler will practically do the same, or Hitler even started earlier, doing the same. This nucleus of, let's say, disposition or emergency force, later on, once the war would come, Hitler will develop this nucleus into a real mass SS army. And at the end of the war, when Germany was defeated, these SS armed forces, or these SS forces, numbered more than 1 million. They were so-called elite soldiers. So in other words, I close this parenthesis, come back to my point. So Himmler's star, from that moment on, was rising rapidly. And Himmler's power and his internal empire inside the Nazi state was now developing fast in every direction. In other words, inside the Nazi state developed a real SS state, which I have already mentioned, and maybe before we turn over to the road to the final solution, I'll say one more word about this situation. So the real winner was Himmler. Himmler, who meanwhile had been given by Hitler control over the Gestapo, that is, over the secret police. Goering had given up this position. Goering was collecting responsible positions, but he had given up this position as head of the Gestapo, and Himmler had taken over. And we'll see more about this later on. Coming back to our issue. So, when now Hindenburg died in late July, early August, Hitler was allowed to take over, not naturally, also the responsibility which, as President of the Republic, as head of state, Hitler hated the word President of the Republic. The Republic always had, in his view, the connotation of a Weimar Republic, and he hated this. So he did not call himself, once he did take over, after Hindenburg's death, Hindenburg's position, he called himself from that moment on Chancellor and Führer, Reichsführer. This was a new title which Hitler had already used earlier, but it was now the equivalent of head of state. He avoided the, there was no authority above him. And in this regard, he was in a more powerful position than Mussolini in Italy, because Mussolini in Italy was head of government. And even though he had the title, he had the name of Duce, which Hitler copied as Führer, but there was nonetheless one authority who above him, and that was the king. The king in Italy was head of state. And Mussolini will later on regret that he had allowed the king to remain in his position, because in 1943, when the war was definitely lost, everybody saw that that the Allies would win the war. In Italy, the king, together even with army units and even with top fascist leaders, they arrested Mussolini because the king still had superior powers. In Germany, this was not the case. In Germany, there was now no authority above Hitler. He was now head of government and head of state as Reichsführer, as a Führer. But in addition, as Führer, as head of state, the army was also under his command. So in other words, as head of state, he was the supreme commander of the armed forces. It was not yet the direct, he will later on in the years passing by, he will increase this hold, this direct hold over there. But for the time being, he was now also head of the army. There was something more which he added, because in the past, the army, the generals and the soldiers had to swear an oath of allegiance to the head of state, to the president of to the institution, head of state. Hitler transformed this oath, which was an impersonal one, into a personal oath of allegiance. In other words, they had to swear loyalty to Adolf Hitler personally, not just Adolf Hitler, head of state, to Adolf Hitler personally. So in other words, it was a more direct personal control. Later on, when the war was lost, and it was only a matter of time before they would ultimately be defeated and they would have to surrender, generals hesitated or refused to disobey orders by Hitler. And they claimed that their oaths forced them to remain loyal to Adolf Hitler personally. That's what they gave as an excuse not to participate in a conspiracy. Later on, when the Nuremberg war criminal trials were held, where a number of generals were tried, and two of them in the top position were condemned to death. We will later on speak about that. That was General Keitel and General Jodl. They claimed that their oath forced them to blindly obey to the orders Hitler was given, and that they could not be unfaithful to this oath. But not, I leave this aside. For the time being, in August 1934, that is a year and a half after he had been appointed Chancellor of the German government in a coalition government, Hitler was now the absolute dictator, totalitarian personal dictator. He controlled Germany like no other head of state or head of government in no country ever had controlled his own people and his own country. Not even Stalin, not even Mao or whomever had such an extensive power than Hitler. Because what were now his command positions? Keep that in mind. First, he was, since he was appointed Chancellor, he was head of government. And as head of government, he could use two unlimited powers. One was a famous presidential decree for the protection of the German people and the German Reich, which allowed him to arrest anybody. And the other one was the enabling law, which granted him unlimited powers to intervene, to make any change in government for 4 years. Now, later on, nobody spoke about these 4 years. So, in other words, head of government, now also head of state. But besides these two official, institutional positions, these were institutional positions, because they were a part of the German state, head of government, head of state. He also occupied, and he was also the supreme commander as head of state, of the army. But in addition, he was also head of the Nazi party. He was the Führer, head of the Nazi party, which was totally subordinated to him. He was head of the SA. He had always been head of the SA, but Röhm had, to some degree, falsified the game when he had practically taken over into his own hands as chief of staff the real control over the SA. But since Röhm was gone, the man who had succeeded him, Lutze, I had mentioned his name last time, Lutze was a nobody. So Hitler was also head of the SA. But the SA will come to the fore only once more. That was in 1938. We will see that during the night of the broken glass, of the Rice Crystal night. Hitler was also head of the SS. He was head of the SS, of course, the man who now, not as chief of staff, but as Reichsführer SS, was nominally, not nominally, was in a sense his replacement, that was Himmler. But Himmler never represented a similar threat to Hitler as Röhm had. Himmler was always referred to by Hitler as the faithful Henry, der treue Heinrich. In other words, he was blindly obedient to Hitler. So he did not represent the threat. So in other words, Hitler was also head of the SS. And of course, with these positions, head of state, head of government, head of the army, head of the party, head of the SA, head of the SS, there was practically no other institution which represented a power center. He controlled all of it. And he did not hesitate. And that was a practice he continued until his death, to play his lieutenants one against the other. It is an illusion, it is a misperception to imagine that the Nazi state was a well-structured, orderly, organized state, where every power was strictly defined compared to the next one. No. The idea behind all this was Hitler played one against the other because this way there could not be a coalition of his underlings, of his lieutenants against him. On the contrary, they rivaled one against the other. And in cases of conflicts, and there were such conflicts, there was only one man who could solve this conflict, and that was Hitler. In other words, when they clashed with one another, Hitler was the one who will make decisions. In the future, nonetheless, in the future, and I speak now on the long run, until the end of the Nazi state and the Third Reich, there will be one more power position, not an official one. Hitler's personal secretary. Hitler's personal secretary was until 1940, that was Hess. Hess, who was already around in the days of Munich, and Hess escaped then with an airplane to England, where he was arrested, and he stayed in jail until he committed suicide in the late 80s. Once Hess had disappeared, a man got into this position. That was Bormann, Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann, he has also the privilege of being treated in Fest. This Bormann was Hitler's personal secretary. Now, where did Bormann's power come from? Not from any precisely defined power position. He could not even give orders. He did not occupy an officially or neither a state nor a party recognized power center. But his power came from the fact that he was the one who controlled the access to Hitler. In other words, if somebody wanted to talk to Hitler or to be received, to have an interview, to come close, he had to go through Bormann. So Bormann's power was that he was practically always in Hitler's immediate entourage and allowing or not allowing people to have access to the Führer. Now, this being said, so far for that. I come back to the main point. So from August 1934 on, Hitler was in absolute control of Germany, of the German people, like nobody else ever had been. And during this 1.5 years, he remained. We will see that when we turn now to this part of our topic. He remained relatively cautious in his foreign policy. But this did not prevent him, while he still established his full control, to move already internally in direction of preparing Germany for the war. That is, in launching already the war machine, the preparation, the war machine in terms of preparation, to get the German industry, to get the German army ready for serving his purpose, the conquest of living space from 1939 on. And the same way did he also, parallel to that, prepare take the first measures, even though that was not yet so visible, for the final solution. Because the conquest of living space, that is the war preparations, went parallel with the preparations of the final solution, that is of the extermination of the Jewish people. Now, so far for that. You must also be aware that this phenomenon, Hitler and his dictatorship, that was a novum. There was nothing comparable to that in German history, and the only comparisons in European history, even though they are not absolutely the same, that was Mussolini. Mussolini was a dictator in Italy, but never such a personal dictator as Hitler was, the only one who could compare to this was Stalin in the Soviet Union. Except that despite of Stalin's tremendous powers and his personal dictatorship, the survival of the Soviet regime, of the communist regime, was not so immediately linked to the survival of Stalin as a person, as the survival of National Socialism was to the life of Hitler. Do you have questions at this point? If things are not clear, or if you have confusing ideas because of this or that, please ask questions. What can I do except to implore you to ask questions in case of confusion in your mind? Yes?
When exactly did Hindenburg die?
I think it might have been in the night between the 31st of July and the 1st of August. It was, I should check, but I'm very close. It was at that time that he died. And he slowly, it was not a sudden, surprising death. He was like a candle. He was slowly, vanishing. But his environment, because he had a secretary, he had advisors, they all were already, I would say, in Hitler's hands. They were playing Hitler's game. Are there other questions? Now, Hindenburg as a personality is a rather, I hesitate to call it fascinating, but a kind of intriguing personality. You must imagine he is a man who already was an officer during the days of Bismarck, when he participated already in the wars of national unification under Bismarck in the 60s. He was a lieutenant in the Prussian army when Bismarck waged war against Austria and against France to unite Germany. Then he was a lieutenant. He was, already present. In World War I, Hindenburg was in command of the eastern Eastern German army, that is the troops which faced the Russians. But nonetheless, even though he was in command of these eastern troops, the man who was really the brain behind this was his chief of staff. And his chief of staff at that time was Ludendorff, even though the two of them won a great victory over the Russian army. That was a battle at Tannenberg. And this battle, which they won, allowed the German army to stop the Russians in 1914. Otherwise, they would have faced maybe even a breakdown on the Eastern Front. So in other words, he became popular, even though it was his chief of staff. He became so popular that in 1916, after 2 years, when the war was on, the emperor appointed him to the supreme command of the whole German army. And at that time he was a field marshal, the highest ranking officer in the German army. There were other field marshals, but he was the top. So for the 2 years that the war continued from 1916 until 1918, he was the commander of the German army, even though still his chief of staff, Ludendorff, was the true strong man behind this. When it was over, when the war was lost, neither Ludendorff nor Hindenburg did sign the armistice. And that was rather unique. A politician, Erzberger, a member of the Zentrum Party, had to go to the front, to France, and to sign the armistice, which was unique, which was unusual. Normally an armistice is signed by generals, and that this will be the case also in at the end of World War II. But here a politician did, because the generals were cowards. And so Hindenburg is the one who made the famous utterance saying that an alleged British general had told him that the German army was never defeated on the front, but was defeated through being stabbed in the back by the home front. It was understood that the home front were the Weimar parties and the Jews. And then he vanished. But he reappeared in 1925 when he became a candidate. He was already at that time in his late 70s, when he became a candidate for the succession of Ebert, who had died from appendicitis. Then he was president of the Republic for 7 years, and then did run for a second mandate where he practically was in office only a little bit more than 1 year. But in this capacity as president of the Republic the last years, he was an honest man, but he was not very bright, and his mind was already slowly declining, so he was exposed to the influence of his entourage. And in this entourage there were two people who were particularly influential. One was his son, Oskar, a colonel, and the other one was Schleicher. And it is in this capacity that, despite his misgivings and his poor opinion on Hitler, that he ultimately appointed Hitler on Papen's urgings in January 1933, and then he continued to tolerate Hitler's doings, and died ultimately giving way then to Hitler. So far for Hindenburg. Do you have other questions? If not, then yes.
What was his relationship like with Mussolini and Stalin?
You mean
Hitler?
Hitler admired Mussolini. Hitler admired Mussolini from earlier days on, when he was still a drummer or a rebel riser in Munich. When he made his first Munich putsch, he admired Mussolini, because Mussolini had made his putsch, which was also half illegal, half legal. Mussolini came to power in October 1922 in Italy, and appointed by the king, but nonetheless after having mobilized his so-called black shirts, because these were the fascist militias. So Hitler admired Mussolini, but Mussolini did not share this admiration for Hitler. Mussolini came close to Hitler much later only, from late 1935, early 1936 on. We will see that. Hitler hated, let's say, communism, and also the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, but we can feel nonetheless, if not an admiration, then at least a certain consideration for Stalin. But and Stalin also had a certain consideration for Hitler, not because of any kind of ideological affinities. They were worlds apart. They had this kind of consideration because of their totalitarian, brutal, scrupulous way of acting. Stalin and Hitler were absolute, responsible in their dictatorship for the death of millions, of tens of millions of people. And because of this ruthlessness, to some degree, they recognized that they were going tough, and that's the only kind of explanation I can see, even though, of course, they considered one another as enemies, and certainly sooner or later open enemies, which they ultimately became. But it was Hitler ultimately who started the war against Stalin.
Whatever happened to Hindenburg's son Oscar after he died? Did he continue to be influential?
I did not check how far and how long he survived his father. He certainly was not looked negatively upon by the Nazis, because Oscar could have prevented Hitler from coming to power. But Oscar, he enjoyed the privilege. His father had been given as a gift by big landowners and big industry a huge landed estate. And so The Hindenburgs were nobles. They were Krautjunkers, you know, these landed big landowners who were noble at the same time. I am not sure, I did not check it lately. He disappeared, he did not play a political role afterwards. He might have died in the late 40s or in the early 50s. Oscar. Yes?
Was the Hitler Youth active during this time, or any other sort of shadow government sort of?
The Hitler Youth became active, much more active, once Hitler was in power. That is from January 1933 on. And Baldur von Schirach, who became the Hitler Youth leader, he and remained leader of the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was one element of totalitarianism. And by the way, I would like to draw your attention to this. This was something which was not unique for Hitler. Hitler, in that sense, he had copied Mussolini, because the fascists had in Italy already a fascist youth movement. That is, a youth movement. When I say youth, it went back to the elementary school, to the young children were already trained and groomed in fascist ideology, and the same was done by the communists. The communists in the Soviet Union had also youth and I would say a youth movement. Hitler and Stalin, they used even the children to spy out the parents and to report whatever was said in negative terms in the family against the regime. It was despicable. You know, the children were practically educated to watch and to listen to what their parents were saying. That was a part of totalitarianism, because here, and later on Mao and the communist regimes, they did the same. That was new in the 20th century. That it was a political movement which was not satisfied alone to control the country politically or militarily, but the control would even go down to the society, to controlling the minds of people. That's what you call total control. There is a difference between a dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorship. A totalitarian dictatorship means that it's usually a party behind it. That the dictator does not only control the institutions, but also tries to control the minds of the citizens. Are there other questions? Okay. Then we turn this page and begin now our next major topic, that is the road towards the war. And then once we are through with this, we will then turn towards the road towards a final solution. Keep in mind that we just for reasons of clarity, we separate both movements, not to mix them up so that it might be confusing. But in reality, these two evolutions went together, and they advanced together. There was no faster going. They were parallel practically. That is why we said that the final solution and conquest of living space were the key elements of National Socialism. Now, the road to the war from 1933 till 1939. This 6 years. Now, the first phase, from 1933 till 1934. During this time period, we can call it the secret rearmament of Germany. And the secret rearmament of Germany and a cautious foreign policy leading towards the outbreak of the war. So secret rearmament and cautious foreign policy, because this corresponds to the time period when Hitler internally consolidated his hold and his dictatorship over the country. The second time period now, from 1935 till 1937, this is a time of open rearmament and first major violations of the Versailles Peace Treaty, short of territorial violations. So in other words, open rearmament and major violations of the Versailles Peace Treaty clauses short of the territorial clauses. And then the last phase from 1938 till 1939, this phase corresponds to the preliminary moves before the conquest of living space. Now, do you remember from what we said about the about Mein Kampf, about the preliminaries before the conquest of the living space would begin? Which were the preliminaries?
The Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, the Polish corridor in Poland, and
You skipped the first one, but you're right. Poland was the last preliminary. The Czechoslovakia,
and Austria.
Austria, yes. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, they were the preliminaries.
I was just, when did like the Jewish population begin to like leave? I guess like when Hitler came to power, when did they start to like some of them leave and feel like something could end up happening?
Here you switch now from the road to the war to the road to the final solution. But to answer your question, yes, a number of Jewish people, higher ups, particularly those who could afford, who were rich and who had good relations abroad, they started already leaving. And then not only bankers, rich people, but also Jewish scientists. Einstein left. And not only Einstein, also a number of others. We will see that when we come to the second phase, that is the road towards a final solution. Now, so in other words, the last 2 years, 38, 39, that was when Hitler, he thought he would get away with the preliminaries. Why did he imagine he would get away? He ultimately was wrong. Where was he wrong? We will see that.
That Britain would
Yes.
intervene.
He thought that the British would let him do, that the British would be content if he would give them insurances that he would not start a naval build-up and that he would not threaten British colonies, that this way the British would ultimately let him act freely in Europe and let him annex or make those annexations. Now, let's begin now with the first phase, 1933, 1934. Here, in order to make things easier for you to keep a clear overlook, we'll take all those events year by year. So we begin with the year 1933. What happened in terms of foreign policy in 1933, in as much as Hitler had a responsibility? Now, the first event, which also had an impact in foreign policy, was Hitler's coming to power. That is, when Hitler came to power, when he was appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, this was not just a domestic event internally for Germany, but this was also something which interested Germany's neighbors. Because after all, the French, the Poles, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Luxembourg people, and all the others, the British, they had witnessed, they had listened to Hitler's utterances, to Hitler's electoral campaigns, to what he had said. So when he came to power, this was a shock, because everybody knew that this would be the beginning of a danger period. And so the question was, would there be already a reaction to this? Would the French react? Or would the Poles react? Now, they did not react. Why did they not react? Because, and this will be like a permanent reason for passivity, because after all those countries were still stuck in the midst of the economic crisis. all the neighbor countries, all the European countries had big problems to get out of the economic crisis. And therefore they did not have an idea that they would now politically or militarily intervene in Germany when Hitler came to power. And of course they would not have been entitled to, because if there is a government change in a neighbor country, that is not enough of an excuse to take military action against it. But nonetheless, one thing was clear, that this represented a threat, and people considered it as such.
Had Hitler met with any of the other foreign leaders of the neighboring countries?
Not yet. No. The French were concerned, and the French had as an idea that maybe not now negative hostile intervention, maybe an international conference should be held where the British, the French, the Italians and the Germans would be invited, and where in such a conference Hitler might be forced to sign a document where he would commit himself to respect the existing borders or the territorial integrity. In other words, an international conference. The French toyed with this idea to organize such a conference in order to put pressure on Hitler to respect the international treaties, and particularly the Versailles Treaty. But this conference did not take place. Why? Because when the Poles, when they heard about this, and they had not been invited, there were only 4 powers invited. These were the British, the French, Germany and Italy. The Poles considered that this was a total disregard for what they considered their power status. And they were mad at the French. The Poles were French allies. And when they imagined that the French had the idea to organize such an international conference without inviting them, they were furious. And in order to assuage them, to calm them, the French dropped the idea. So no such conference would take place. But the scheme will be revived. The scheme of a 4-power conference will be revived. Now, I should not ask you the question, because normally you could not know that. But maybe somebody knows. In 1938, such a 4-power conference was held. Where? When? I forgive you this time, because unless you have already read in Bullock or in your history, you could know. Munich. The Munich conference is like a revival of this early French idea. But for the time being, the idea was dropped. Next thing was, Hitler observed very cautious, very, I would say, narrowly what was going on. So, a few weeks later, when he was already in power, Japan declared publicly that it dropped out of the League of Nations. The Japanese quit the League of Nations. Now, this was an important event. Why was it an important event? And for Hitler, it was very interesting and very important. For Hitler, it was important because the Japanese were under pressure. From 1931 on, the Japanese army had occupied Manchuria, that is 3 Chinese provinces on the Chinese mainland. And this was an open violation of the integrity, of the territorial integrity of a country. Now, it was an aggression, in a sense. And the Japanese were condemned by the League of Nations, but nonetheless, this League of Nations could not make up its mind to take military action against the Japanese, because the only countries which could have taken military action against the Japanese would have been the British. They had armed forces in the Far East, and the United States. But the US Army in the Far East was a skeleton army. They had, US forces altogether. By the way, where were your forces stationed? America.
The Philippines?
Yes, on the Philippines. On the Philippines, and the number of islands which the United States had occupied, taking over those islands after the Germans had been defeated, but in the Philippines. And there was particularly one higher officer who spent some time in the Philippines in the 20s and 30s. And he will play a key role soon, in the early 40s. Who was this officer? Within the American Army. One of your most brilliant generals.
MacArthur?
Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur spent years in the Far East and was observing what was going on. Okay, after this digression, which I nonetheless welcome because that allows you to link all this history to your own history, let's come back to the point. So the Japanese did not have to fear a military intervention, neither on the part of the British nor on the part of the US, but they got tired of being condemned now on the tribune of the League of Nations in Geneva. And so tired of being always orally, verbally condemned, they decided to quit. So they quit the League of Nations. And this quittal of the Japanese did not entail consequences. Neither the United States, nor the British, nor anybody else would now take economic measures, for instance, to boycott the Japanese. No. They got out, and of course, from that moment on, they could claim that they did not have to respect the rules, the principles of the Charter of the League of Nations. That was the second event, and Hitler noticed this very carefully. Third event. In July 1933, to the amazement of the international public opinion and also of the other governments, Hitler signed a concordate with the Vatican. What is a concordate? A concordate is a technical word for an agreement, for a treaty between a lay state and the Vatican. And in this concordate, Hitler practically officially recognized that the Nazi regime would respect the religious liberty of the Catholic Church and also of the properties of this church. And in exchange, the Catholic Church promised that they would not interfere in political matters, but let's say the Pope at that time, that was Pius XI, he did not recognize Nazi Germany as such, but nonetheless, he had signed an agreement with the German government, and this German government was Hitler, the Nazi government. So that even though it did not imply an official recognition of the Nazis as such, but it gave nonetheless Hitler a moral boost, because here there was the Pope who signed an agreement with the Nazi government of Germany, which had a very bad reputation already, internationally speaking, because of their anti-Semitic policy and because of the first anti-Semitic measures which Hitler had already initiated once he was in power. So in other words, Hitler did take advantage of this in moral terms, because he could claim, after all, the Nazis could not be that bad if the Pope signed an agreement with them. So in that sense, it was a moral boost for Hitler. Then we come to the fourth event, which did take place in September 1933, and this was by far the second event here. This concordate is important, but the fourth event is by far more important. The fourth event was when in September Hitler officially proclaimed that Germany also would quit the League of Nations. and that Germany would quit the International Conference on Disarmament. Because there was such a conference going on which did not make any kind of important progress, but Hitler proclaimed that Germany would quit the League of Nations as well as the Disarmament Conference. And he had this decision approved by a referendum. In other words, he organized in Germany a public referendum and even also elections, where the Nazis got 99% of the vote. So the German public approved this move of quitting the League of Nations and also of quitting the Disarmament Conference. Now, Hitler acted very cleverly by doing this, because he made a speech when he quit. And in this speech, he reassured all Germany's neighbors. He said, you should not be afraid. We are ready to sign any kind of treaty with you where we would recognize and stick to your security. We are not threatening you. But his argument was the following, where you see how clever he was and how, at the same time, insidious. He said, we Germans, we have disarmed since 1919. From the end of World War I on, we have disarmed, and in this clause of the German disarmament in 1919, the Versailles Peace Treaty, there was a reference, that it was stated that the German disarmament should be the beginning of an international disarmament. And so Hitler said, look, we have done our part, our disarmament, but no other country has followed us. The French have not disarmed, the British have not, the others should disarm. Why should we be treated differently? What he, of course, passed over in silence was that the German disarmament was not a free disarmament, that was a part of the Versailles Peace Treaty, that they were forced to disarm, the same way as they had been forced to give up territories. But nonetheless, this, of course, found very propitious ears on the part of the German people. The German people approved Hitler's speech, saying, we have done our part, they haven't. It is important because none of the German neighbors reacted to this. At this time, the French as well as the Poles at least envisioned a possible reaction on the part of the French army, of the Polish army, in face of the German quitting of the disarmament conference. But ultimately, neither the French nor the Poles acted. So in other words, they just abstained from taking measures against the Germans. So in other words, Hitler got by. And in this regard, this was for him a victory. Because at the end of 1933, he was in power and he had already, except for the presidency, the SA and the army, he had already the country under his full control. He had quit the disarmament conference. And the neighbors of the Germans, the Poles as well as the French, they knew that Hitler was secretly rearming. In other words, he had given orders to start rearming at once. So in other words, even though on paper Hitler would of course not claim that he was rearming, but the French, the British intelligence service, they knew that the Germans were secretly rearming, that they were building armament factories. In other words, that was not a secret, but they did not react. Nothing happened. And so in this regard, Hitler could be satisfied. When the year was over, He was now practically for 1 year in power, and nothing hostile had been done. So we get to the year 1934. The year 1934 was much more eventful. There were much more events taking place of great importance. And there was one event right at the beginning in January where Hitler did take the initiative and surprised practically everybody. Hitler, in January 1934, signed a treaty with Poland. Hitler signed with Poland a non-aggression plan. And this non-aggression pact was very important because it meant a radical change in German foreign policy. What does this imply, the non-aggression pact? The two countries pledged themselves that they would not take military action against their neighbor, against one another. What was so new in this? But what was new was that from the end of World War I on, until January 1934, that is during the Weimar Republic, the Germans considered as their enemy, one of their enemies, if not their enemy number one, Poland. The relations between Germans and Poles were bad. This had as a consequence that the Weimar Republic diplomacy made links with the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that they hated communism, the Soviet Union was an ally of the Weimar Republic, or at least a friendly country. Would it only be because the Soviet Union was considered also an enemy by the Poles? Now, why did Hitler now change this foreign policy? Why did he all of a sudden now start extending a friendly hand to the Poles? That was, of course, calculation. Hitler was eager to get the Poles closer to Germany, to be sure that he would have nothing to fear on the part of the Poles on his eastern border, because he knew on the western border there would always be a hostile France. And Hitler felt that he could not afford to have two enemy countries on both sides. Therefore, he wanted to have the Poles quiet. And so he was willing to sign this treaty with Poland, so that he would only have to concentrate on the French and not on both at the same time. The question, of course, would also be, why did the Poles then sign with the Germans? Well, the Poles signed with the Germans for the same reason. Because by 1934, the Poles became aware that they had two neighbors on both sides, west and east, which were recovering fast from World War I. One was Germany, and the other one was the Soviet Union. And both were hostile to Poland. And the Poles considered that on the long run, they could not afford to have two enemies on both sides. And so they considered as their most dangerous enemy, not the Germans, but the Russians. And so in order to have at least one border safe and quiet, they were willing to sign with Hitler, so that they would only have Stalin on their back. It was the same consideration than Hitler. But of course, that was not the end of the consequences of this non-aggression pact, because this also meant that, first of all, the Poles were changing their attitude towards France. France had been an ally of Poland. This alliance still existed, but the signing of a non-aggression pact with Hitler Germany, who was of course to be considered as an enemy of France, would bring the French in a difficult situation. This would mean that the French alliance with Poland was not worth very much, and in the eyes of the French. And that is why the French now started looking for a replacement for this alliance with Poland. They did not declare the alliance dead, but nonetheless they looked for a replacement. So the French started making new approaches to the Soviet Union. And there was a French Minister of Foreign Affairs by the name of Barthou, B-A-R-T-H-O-U, Barthou. Barthou was a French conservative, you could say nationalist Minister of Foreign Affairs, and this Barthou was an old politician who had already been, let's say, involved in an earlier alliance between France and Russia before World War I. So in other words, Barthou wanted to revive the old traditional alliance between Russia and France, which had preceded World War I. Nonetheless, in order to bring this Barthou scheme to an end, the poor Barthou was killed soon afterwards. He died in a political assassination of the King of Yugoslavia on visit in France. The King of Yugoslavia had come to France in 1934, and he had landed in Marseille. And in Marseille, shortly after his landing, a Croatian nationalist, we would call him terrorist, a Croatian terrorist threw a bomb against the king's retinue. And the Yugoslav king was badly wounded and would die as a consequence. But the French higher official who had come to welcome him was Barthou. Barthou was also badly wounded. And while everybody had only eyes for the king to try to save the king, Barthou was bleeding to death on the sidewalk. So in other words, in this assassination attempt, the French foreign minister died. But he was the key figure to revive such an alliance with the Soviet Union. His successor was a man by the name of Laval, L-A-V-A-L, Laval. Laval was a French conservative, you could say, nearly a fascist, a French conservative who had not the slightest willingness to sign an alliance with the Soviet Union because he hated communism and the left. So in other words, this scheme on the French side to revive an alliance with Russia failed. But of course, the French were not the only ones to be concerned. There was somebody else to be concerned. And this somebody else to be concerned over this signing of this treaty was Stalin. Stalin was upset when he heard about this because Hitler made no secret that he was an anti-communist and that he would end these friendly relations and also this secret cooperation between the German army and the Red Army. So in other words, Stalin considered that from now on he would have to face a hostile Germany. And as Stalin was in a similar position than the Germans, he had two hostile neighbors now. One hostile neighbor were the Poles. The other hostile neighbor in the Far East were the Japanese. So in other words, Stalin became concerned over and now another hostile neighbor will be the Germans on the West. So in other words, Stalin became concerned over the perspective of having to face in the near or in the not too distant future a war on two fronts. One in the Far East against Japan, and another one in the West, probably Hitler. And so Stalin then made a basic decision. Until 1934, Stalin had given the guideline that the communists should consider as their most dangerous enemies the Western democracies, the Western capitalist countries. That is England, France, United States, and so on. They were the capitalists. And of course, they were those who opposed communism for ideological reasons, of course. Now he gave out the order to the Communist International, Comintern, that they should consider as the most dangerous enemy the fascism. That is Hitler, Germany, Mussolini's Italy, fascism in general, and that they should give up attacking in their home countries the socialist and the liberal, the democratic parties. So in other words, Stalin gave the order for a total shift in the attitude of the communist parties in France, in England, elsewhere, that they should now try to set up alliances, popular fronts, with the liberals and with the socialists against fascism, against the fascist danger. So in other words, in 2 of the European countries, such popular fronts were organized. And these 2, let me just finish my phrase and I let you off. I see that you are already in spirit far away from this classroom. Now, I understand it. So they were now forming popular fronts, communists, socialists, liberals, in 2 countries, France and in Spain. We will stop here and then see further consequences next time.